All right. Welcome to Documents and Drafts, the podcast where we take a look at important historical documents, especially important to the United States, and we try to drink some really cool beers along the way. We will look at the background of each document and then read each document. And then we will also talk about the beer that we're drinking. Today, we're drinking a Helles from Germany. It's called Helles Eschenwerter Lager beer, brewed by Bamberg. And I'll read some more stuff about it later. This time, we are going to talk about the two things: the Louisiana Purchase, and the Lewis and Clark Expedition. We'll read two things from that. If we have time, we will take a look at current Supreme Court cases and a couple of historical cases, and we will go from there. The book we're using today is Our Nation's Archives, the History of the United States in Documents, edited by Eric Brunn and Jay Crosby. And we're going to read a thing about the Louisiana Purchase and then a piece by Meriwether and Lewis from Lewis and Clark. So let me pull the PowerPoint up, which I meant to do. So there's a map about the Louisiana Purchase. Here, hang on, let me go back to Zoom. Let me hit the share screen. There we are. Now you can see me. There's the map of the Louisiana Purchase, basically doubled the size of the United States. There's the Lewis and Clark Expedition map. We're going to drink some beer. We're going to talk some SCOTUS. And there's the thank you. Podcast is all available on Spreaker.com, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Podcast Addict, and YouTube and other platforms. Music is provided by Soundstripe. I use the blues genre. I actually need to change it because I play the same music all the time. The book, again, today we're using is Our Nation's Archives, edited by Eric Brunn and Jay Crosby. The pictures are by Getty Images. I forgot to change that. The SCOTUS info is from SCOTUS blog and from Oye. The cover art was done by a former student, Emma Williams, and the YouTube help was done by also a former student, Olivia Baldwin. So I appreciate that for everybody. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to take a sip of the Helles Lager beer. And then we are going to read about the Louisiana Purchase. So here's the background. Jefferson approached Napoleon Bonaparte of France in 1803 with an offer to purchase a small portion of Louisiana and a coastal section of the Florida territories, which France had recently taken from Spain. Napoleon shocked the United States envoy with a counteroffer to sell the entire Louisiana territory, a massive 888,000 square miles that would almost double the size of the United States, rather than allow Great Britain to gain control over it. Jefferson seized the opportunity and quickly secured a deal acquiring the territory, which encompassed most of the watershed of the mighty Mississippi River, for $15 million. Largely unoccupied at the time, the Louisiana Purchase included what would become Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, as well as parts of Colorado, Kansas, Minnesota, Montana, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. The acquisition also secured the Mississippi River as a critical trade route for the Northwest Territory. All right, so that's the background. Here is a little story about it. The President of the United States and the First Council of the French Republic, in the name of the French people, desiring to remove all sorts of misunderstanding relative to objects of discussion mentioned in the second and fifth articles of the Convention of the 8th Vendemiaire and on the 9th September 1800, relative to the rights claimed by the United States. In virtue, the treaty concluded at Madrid on the 27th October 1795 between His Catholic Majesty and said United States, and willing to strengthen the union and friendship which at the time of said convention was happily reestablished between the two nations, have respectively named their plenipotentiaries, to wit, the President of the United States, by with and advice and consent of the Senate of said states. Robert Livingston, Minister of Plenipotentiary of the United States, and James Monroe, Minister of Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary of the said states, near the government of the French Republic, and the first consul in the name of the French people, citizens Francis Barbe-Marbles, Minister of the Public Treasury, who, having respectfully exchanged their full powers, have agreed to the following articles. Article 1, whereas by the article of the third treaty concluded at St. Ildefonso on the 9th of October 1800 between the First Council of the French Republic and His Catholic Majesty, it was agreed as follows. His Catholic Majesty promises and engages on his part to cede the French Republic 6 months after the full and entire execution of the conditions and stipulations herein relative to His Royal Highness the Duke of Parma, the colony and province of Louisiana, which the same extends that it now has in the hands of Spain, and that it had when French possessed it, and such as it should be after the treaty subsequently entered between Spain and the other states. And whereas in pursuant to the treaty, and particularly of the third article, the French Republic has an incontestable title to the domain and the possession of said territory. The first consul of the French Republic, desiring to give the United States a strong proof of his friendship, doth hereby cede to the said United States, in the name of the French Republic, forever and in full sovereignty, the said territory with all its rights and appurtenances, as fully as in the same manner as they have been acquired by the French Republic, in virtue of this above-mentioned treaty, concluded with His Catholic Majesty. Article 2, in the secession made by the preceding articles and included the adjacent islands belonging to Louisiana, all public lots and squares, vacant lands, and all public buildings, fortifications, barracks, and other edifices which are not private property, the archives, papers, and documents relative to the domain and sovereignty of Louisiana and its dependents will be left to the possession of the commissaries of the United States, and the copies will afterwards given in due form to the magistrates and municipal officers of such of said papers and documents may be necessary to them. Article 3, the inhabitants of the ceded territory shall be incorporated in the Union of the United States and admitted as soon as possible, according to the principles of the French Constitution and the enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. And in the meantime, they shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and religion which they profess. Article 4, there shall be sent by the government of France a commissary to Louisiana to the end that he do every act necessary as well to receive the officer of His Catholic Majesty, the said country and its dependents in the name of the French Republic, if it has not been already done, as to transmit it in the name of the French Republic to the commissary or agent of the United States. Article 5, immediately after the ratification of the present treaty of the President of the United States, and in the case of the first consul shall have been previously obtained, and the commissary of the French Republic shall remit all military posts of New Orleans and other parts of the ceded territory to the commissary or commissaries named by the President to take possession. The troops, whether of France or Spain, who may be there, shall cease to occupy any military post from the time of taking possession and shall be embarked as soon as possible in the course of 3 months after the ratification of this treaty. Article 6. The United States promises to execute such treaties and articles that may have been agreed upon between Spain and the tribes and the nation of Indians until by mutual consent of the United States, and said tribes or nations or other suitable articles shall have been agreed upon. Article 7. As it is reciprocally advantageous to the commerce of France and the United States to encourage the communication of both nations for a limited time in the country ceded to the present treaty until general arrangements relative to the commerce of both nations may be agreed upon. It has been agreed between the contracting parties that the French ships coming directly from France or any of her colonies loaded only when the produce and manufacture of Spain or her said colonies with the ships of Spain coming directly from Spain or any of her colonies loaded only with the produce or manufacture of Spain or her colonies shall be admitted during the space of 12 years in the port of New Orleans and in all other legal ports of entry within the ceded territory. In the same manner as the ships of the United States coming directly from France or Spain or any of their colonies without being subject to any other or greater duty or merchandise or other greater tonnage than is paid by the citizens of the United States. During the space of time above mentioned, no other nation shall have a right to the same privileges in the ports of the ceded territory. The 12 years shall commence 3 months after the exchange and ratification. If it shall take place in France, or 3 months after it shall have been notified at Paris to the French government. If it shall take place in the United States, it is, however, well understood that the object of the above article is to favor the manufactures, commerce, freight, and navigation of France and Spain, so far as it relates to the importance of the French and Spanish, shall make it into said ports of the United States without in any sort of affecting the regulations the United States may make concerning the exportation of the produce and merchandise of the United States, or any right they may have to make such regulations. Article 8. In the future and forever after the expiration of the 12 years, the ship of France shall be treated upon footing of the most favored nations and ports above mentioned. Article 9. The particular convention signed this day by the respective ministers, having for its object to provide for the payment of debts due to the citizens of the United States by the French Republic prior to the 30th September 1800, is approved in the execution in the same manner as if it had been inserted in the present treaty. And it shall be ratified in the same form and in the same time, so that one shall not be ratified distinct from the other. Another particular convention signed at the same date as the present treaty, relative to a definitive rule between the contracting parties, is in the like manner approved and will be ratified in the same form and in the same time and jointly. Article 10, the present treaty shall be ratified in good and due form, and the ratification shall exchange in the space of 6 months after the date of the signature by the ministers plenipotentiary or sooner if possible. In faith whereof the respective plenipotentiaries have signed these articles in French and English language, declaring nevertheless that the present treaty was originally agreed to in the French language and have thereunto affixed their seals. So that is a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase. Let me check where we are here. Again, the music is provided by Soundstripe. Take a little break. I'm going to again drink this Helles lager beer that my son brought for me at World Market for my birthday. Here's what it says on the back, if I could read it. Helles Schlenkerlau lager is brewed with the fine Bavarian aroma hops and lagered in the 14th century beer cellars underneath the Schlenkerlau brewery and maltings. It is boiled in the same copper kettles and the bottom fermented by the same yeast as the classic Echt Schenkerlau Rauchbier. Its subtle smokiness hence makes the Schenkerlau style a unique representative of the traditional German lager beer type Helles. It's pretty good. It's not something you're going to find everywhere. Again, I think pretty sure they bought it at World Market. All right, so the next thing we're going to read about is the Lewis and Clark expedition. If you can see from the map, it was from 1804 to 1806, and they looks like they started in southern Illinois, is now southern Illinois. All right, so again, from this book, Our Nation's Archives, edited by Eric Brown and Jay Crosby. There's a piece in here from Meriwether Lewis. We're going to read that. So here's the background. Having acquired the Louisiana Territory, Jefferson commissioned his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark to explore the new purchased land and to find the most direct and practical water communication across the continent for purposes of commerce. Jefferson also charged them with gathering scientific information, investigating commercial opportunities, and fostering friendly relations with the local Native American tribes on the journey. Most people believed at the time it was a relatively short distance from the western headwaters of the Missouri River to the eastern source of the Columbia River, which would take them to Oregon and the Pacific Ocean. Lewis, Clark, and their 32 men, however, were disappointed to discover that the Rocky Mountains lay in the way of this overland link. Led by their Shoshone guide, Sacagawea, they persevered and were able to communicate with Native American tribes who showed them where and how to traverse the Rocky Mountains. In this excerpt from Lewis's diary, he described how they learned of a specific overland route that would take them over the Continental Divide to the Columbia River and identified the Nez Perce to lead them on this leg of the journey. Let's get the music restarted here for you. All right, here we go. Not too long. I walked down the river about 3/4 of a mile and settled a place near the river bank, unperceived by the Indians, for a cache, which I set 3 men to make, and directed the sentinel to discharge his gun if he perceived any of the Indians going down in the direction which was to be the signal for the men at work on the cache to desist and separate. I think he means like cache, CACHE, as storage. By the evening, the cache was completed unperceived by the Indians, and all our packages were made up. The pack saddles and harness is not yet complete. In this operation, we find ourselves at a loss for nails and boards. For the first, we substitute thongs of rawhide, which answer very well, and for the last, had to cut off the blade of our oars and use the plank of some boxes, which have heretofore held other articles, and put those articles into sacks of raw hides, which I have made for the purpose. By this means, I have obtained as many boards as will make 20 saddles, which I suppose will be sufficient for our present exigencies. I made up a small assortment of medicines together with the specimen of plants, minerals, and seeds, which I have collected between this place and the falls of the Missouri, which I shall deposit here. I now prevailed on the chief to instruct me with respect to the geography of this country, but he undertook very cheerfully by delineating the rivers on the ground, but I soon found that his information fell short of my expectations or wishes. He drew the river on which we now are, the Lemhi, to which he placed 2 branches just above us, which he showed me from the opening of the mountains were in view. But next he made it discharge itself into a large river which flowed from the southwest about 10 miles below us. The salmon then continued this joint stream in the same direction of the valley or northwest for 1 day's march, and then inclined it to the west for 2 more days' march. Here he placed a number of heaps of sand on each side, which he informed me represented the vast mountains of rock eternally covered with snow through which the river passed. That the perpendicularly, even jutting rocks so closely hemmed in the river that there was no possibility of passing along the shore. That the bed of the river was obstructed by sharp-pointed rocks, and the rapidity of the stream such that of the whole surface of the river was beat into perfect foam as far as the eyes could reach. That the mountains were also inaccessible to the man or horse. He said that this being the state of the country in the direction that he himself or none of his nations had ever been further down the river than these mountains. I then inquired the state of the country on either side of the river, but he could not inform me. He said that there was an old man of his nation, a day's march below where below who could probably give me some information of the country of the Northwest, and referred to me to an old man then present for the Southwest. The chief further informed me that he had understood from the Nez Perce Indians who inhabited this river below the Rocky Mountains that it ran a great way toward the setting sun and finally lost itself into a great lake of water, which was illy tasted, and where the white men lived. I next commenced my inquiries of the old man to whom I had been referred for formation relative, lost my place, commenced my inquiries of the old man to whom I had been referred for information relative to the country southwest of us. This he depicted with horrors and obstructions scarcely inferior to that just mentioned. He informed me that the band of this nation to which he belonged resided in the distance of 20 days' march from hence, not far from the white people with whom they traded for horses, mules, cloth, metal, beads, and shells, which they wore as ornaments, being those of a species of pearly oyster, that the course to his relations was a little to the west of south, that in order to get his relations the first 7 days, we should be obliged to climb over steep and rocky mountains where we could find no game to kill nor anything but roots such as fursy and warlike nations lived on, whom he called the broken Mocrasons, or with holes. He said inhabit these mountains and lived like the bear of other countries among the rocks and fed on the roots or the flesh of such horses as they could take or steal from those who passed through their country. That in passing this country, the feet of the horses would be so much wounded with the stones that many of them would give out. The next part of the route was about 10 days through a dry and parched sandy desert in which there is no food at this season for either man or horse, and in which we must suffer, if not perish, for the want of water. That the sun had now dried up a little pools of water which exist through the desert plain in the spring season, that also scorched all the grass, that no animal inhabited this plain of which we could hope to subsist. That about the center of this plain a large river passed from southeast to northwest, which was navigable but afforded neither salmon nor timber. That beyond this plain, 3 or 4 days' march, his relations lived in a country tolerable fertile and partially covered with timber on another large river which ran in the same direction of the former. That this last discharged itself into a large river in which many numerous nations lived, with whom his relations were at war. Whether this last discharged itself into a great lake or not, he did not know. That from his relations it was yet a great distance to the great stinking lake, as they called the ocean. That the way which sure of his nation had been to the stinking lake, traveled up the river on which they had lived, and over to that on which the white people lived, which last they knew discharged itself into the ocean. And that this was the way which he would advise me to travel if I was determined to proceed to the ocean, but would advise me to put off the journey until the next spring when he would conduct me. I thanked him for his information and advice, and gave him a knife for which he appeared to be much gratified. From this narrative, I was convinced that the streams of which he had spoken as running through the plains and on which his relations lived were southern branches of the Columbia, heading with the rivers Apostle and Colorado, and that the route he had pointed out was the Vermilion Sea or Gulf of California. I therefore told him that the route was more to the south than I had wished to travel, and requested to know if there was no route on the left of the river, which we now are, or by means which I could intercept it below and the mountains through which it passes. But he could not inform me that of any except the barren plain, which he said joined the mountains on that side, and through which it was impossible for us to pass as the season, even if it were fortunate enough to escape from the broken Moccasin Indians. I now ask Camawat by what route the pierced-nosed Indians, who informed me inhabited this river below the mountains, came over to the Missouri. This, he informed me, was to the north, but added that the road was very bad, when he had been informed by them and that they had suffered excessively with hunger on the route, being obliged to subsist for many days on berries alone, and there was no game in that part of the mountain, which was were broken, rocky, and thickly covered with timber, that they could scarcely pass. However, knowing that the Indians had passed and did pass at this season on this side of the river, the same below the mountains, my route was instantly settled in my own mind, provided the account of this river should prove true on an investigation of it, which I was determined should be made before we would undertake the route by land in any direction. I felt perfectly satisfied that if the Indians could pass these mountains with their women and children, that we could also pass them, and that if the nations on this river below the mountains were as numerous as they were stated to be, that they must have some means of subsistence which would be equally in our power to procure in the same country. They informed me that there was no buffalo on the west side of the mountain, and that the game consisted of a few elk, deer, and antelopes, and that the natives subsisted on fish and roots principally. In this manner, I spent a day smoking with them and acquiring what information I could with respect to their country. They informed me that they could pass to the Spaniards by way of the Yellowstone River in 10 days. I can discover that these people are by no means friendly to the Spaniards. Their complaint is that the Spaniards will not let them have firearms and ammunition, that they put them off by telling them that if they suffer them to have guns, they will kill each other, thus leaving them defenseless and easy prey to their bloodthirsty neighbors to the east of them, who, being in possession of firearms, hunt them up and murder them without respect to sex or age, and plunder them of their horses on all occasions. They told me that to avoid their enemies who were eternally harassing them, that they were obliged to remain in the interior of these mountains at least two-thirds of the year, where they suffered, as we saw, their great hardships for want of food, sometimes living for weeks without meat and only on little fish roots and berries. But this added Chemaway, with his fierce eyes and lank jaw, grow meager for the want of food, who would not be the case if we had guns. We could then live in the country of buffalo and eat as our enemies do, and not be compelled to hide ourselves in these mountains and live off roots and berries as the bears do. We do not fear our enemies when placed on equal footing with them. I told them that the Minnetarees, Mandans, and Ricaires of the Missouri had promised us to desist from making war on them, and that we would endeavor to find a means of making the Minnetarees to Fort Prairie, or as they call them, Pacas, desist from waging war against them also. That after our finally returning to our homes toward the rising sun, white men would come to them with an abundance of guns and every other article necessary for their defense and comfort, and that they would enable to supply themselves with the articles on reasonable terms in exchange for the skins of beaver, otter, and ermine so abundant in their country. They expressed great pleasure as they had been long anxious to see the white men that traded guns, and that they might rest assured that the friendship that they would do whatever we wished them to do. I'm guessing we did not follow through with that promise, because that's normally what we did with the Native Americans, unfortunately. All right, I know we're missing some music, so let's see if we can get it restarted. Music is again provided by Soundstripe. All right, again, we're drinking Helles Lager today from Bamberg. It's pretty good. All right. Ah, now, what are we going to do here? Get rid of the PowerPoint for a second. We are going to, we got a little bit of time, so we're going to look at some SCOTUS decisions, quickie, and a couple of historical decisions, and then we will be done for today. So let me see if I can pull those up. No, it's not the one that I wanted. Hang on a second here. Well, we'll do these first. We'll do the history first. We're going to do the Martin v. Hunter's lessee. So let's read that. During the American Revolution, Virginia created a law allowing the state to seize property of loyalists. In 1781, Denny Martin, a British subject, inherited land from his uncle, a loyalist. The following year, the Virginia legislature voided the land grant and transferred the land back to Virginia. Virginia granted a portion of this land to David Hunter. A federal treaty dictated that Lord Fairfax was entitled to the property. The Virginia Supreme Court upheld Virginia's laws permitting the confiscation of property, even though it conflicted with the federal treaty. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed and remanded, holding that the treaty superseded state law under the Supremacy Clause of Article 6. On remand, the Virginia Court of Appeals declined to follow the ruling. It argued that the law granted the Supreme Court appellate review over state court decisions, which was Section 25 of the Judiciary Act. That Section 25 of the Judiciary Act was unconstitutional. Question, is Section 25 of the Judiciary Act, which grants the U.S. Supreme Court appellate review over state court cases involving federal law, unconstitutional? Unanimous decision for Martin, majority opinion by Joseph Story. No. Article 6 of the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, combined with the grant of appellate jurisdiction in Article 3, gives federal courts the power to review state court decisions that interpret federal law or the Constitution. The court rejected the claim that Virginia and the nation's government were equal sovereigns. Relying on the Supremacy Clause, the Justice Story held that federal interpretations of federal law should supersede state interpretation. He reasoned there should be uniform and predictable outcomes across all states. And he's probably right. All right. Here. I knew it would do that. What's that? Let's look at Mayor of New York versus Milne. August 1830, or January 1837. A state law requires all vessels docking in New York City to provide a list of passengers and to post security against passengers for becoming public charges. Milne, the master of the ship Emily, refused to comply with the law. The city sought to collect a penalty for Milne's failure to file the report. So the question is, does New York law violate the Commerce Clause, which vests all power over interstate and foreign commerce in Congress? Conclusion, the court upheld the state law. The justices ducked the Commerce Clause issue and invoked what was to become the state's police power, the right of a sovereign to take all necessary steps to protect the health and safety and welfare of its citizens. According to Barber, who wrote the majority opinion, a state is competent to provide precautionary measures where was I? Precautionary measures. State, all necessary to take to the right of a sovereign to take all necessary steps to protect health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. According to Barber, who wrote the majority opinion, as a state is as competent to provide a precautionary measures against the moral pestilence of paupers, vagabonds, and possible convicts, as it is to guard against the physical pestilence which may arise from unsound and infectious articles imported. The court reversed Milne in 1941. Interesting. All right, that's from Oye. That's a little history today. Now we're going to SCOTUS blog. So here's kind of the things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. Justices strike down campaign finance law. Don't really know that one, so I might have to look at that real quick. Court rules that state can exclude transgender athletes from girls' and women's sports teams. The Supreme Court strikes down Trump's order extending birthright citizenship. I do think maybe they'll codify that a little bit more, but it'll be up to Congress to do it. Court rules that law enforcement use of geofence warrant was a search. Justices uphold the state law for late arriving mail-in ballots. Court prevents Trump from firing a Federal Reserve governor. However, the Supreme Court allows Trump to fire FTC commissioner and overturns a major restraint on presidential power. Court rules for Roundup maker in dispute over cancer warnings on pesticide labels. The justices sides with Trump administration border dispute over asylum seekers. The court allows the Trump administration to end removal protections from Syrian and Haitian nationals. And the Supreme Court strikes down Hawaii's gun restrictions. And the court sides of the government dispute over rights of green card holders accused of committing a crime. So the campaign finance law, when I don't know that one, so let's look at that one real quick. Supreme Court on Tuesday issued a major ruling on money in elections by a vote of 6-3. The justice struck down a federal law that limited the amount of money political parties can spend in coordination with a candidate for office. The majority opinion, written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, agreed with the challengers that the coordinated expenditure time limits violate the First Amendment. Writing for the court, Kavanaugh said that Tuesday's ruling treats all political parties equally. We allow all political parties, including the DNC and RNC and their respective Senate and House campaign committees, as well as other parties and party committees, to participate more freely and compete more fully in the political process and to coordinate more closely with their candidates. In a dissenting opinion, joined by Justice Sotomayor and Jackson, Justice Elena Kagan argued that the majority's opinion rewrites the rules to allow circumvention of contribution limits. The expenditure limits are at the center of the case as part of the FEC Campaign Act of 2022. Four challengers, then J.D. Vance, Steve Chabot, and National Republican Senatorial Committees, went to federal court in Cincinnati. They argued that the coordinated party limits violate the First Amendment, preventing the committees from working with candidates to ensure their advertisements have the same political message. So anyway, that's what happened with that. So that's kind of the courts. We are kind of finished for today. So I want to thank you for listening to Documents and Drafts. We talked about the Louisiana Purchase. We talked about the Lewis and Clark expedition with an excerpt from Meriwether Lewis. We drank some Helles Lager beer. We talked about SCOTUS. And again, the podcast is available on Spreaker.com, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Podcast Addict, YouTube, and other platforms. Music was provided by Soundstripe. A book today was used Our Nation's Archives, edited by Eric Brown and Jay Crosby. The maps from Getty Images, the SCOTUS information from SCOTUS blog and Oye. Cover art was created by Emma Williams, and the help for my little YouTube channel is done by Olivia Baldwin. So I want to thank everybody. Let's stop the sharing. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening, and hope you have a great time and all that fun kind of stuff. And we'll talk to you soon.